Oh, whoa. I just realized that this example from Gareth Evans in 1973 is the plot of the show Mad Men. Oh, okay, let me explain that. So far in this course, we've been talking about proper names, like Napoleon. And at this point, there are two dominant theories explaining proper names. We've got Searle's cluster of descriptions theory from 1958. According to Searle's theory, you have a name, and associated with that name, Napoleon Bonaparte, is a bunch of information, a cluster of descriptions. And this information is stuff about the object or the person, right? So Napoleon conquered most of Europe. He was imprisoned on Elba, which is an island in the Mediterranean Sea. He crowned himself emperor. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but he crowned himself. Like, he took the crown away from the Pope because the Pope wasn't good enough to crown him, and he just put the crown on his own head. Anyway, there's this cluster of descriptions or this body of information. And then the name refers to the guy. This is Napoleon. I drew like a little hat because I think he mostly wears a hat. This guy is the referent of the name because he fits enough of these descriptions in the cluster. Then in 1970, this young prodigy named Saul Kripke comes along. He attacks Searle's theory, shows that it can't be right, and then gives his own theory or the outline of a theory, which is a causal chain theory. On Kripke's theory, this whole cluster of information, although there is that cluster, it doesn't establish the reference between the name and the object, right? The fact that this is the thing that this is the name of. Instead, the way it works on Kripke's theory is that when Napoleon, or anyone or anything, when Napoleon was a baby, his parents looked at him or whatever, somebody, and they pointed at him or something like that, and they dubbed him Napoleon. And then his parents told other people, they said, we had a baby and we named him Napoleon. And then these other people, even if they did not meet the baby yet, they knew about the name and they thought to themselves something along the lines of, now I'm going to use the name Napoleon and I'm going to use it to refer to whichever baby these people used their name Napoleon to refer to. And then there gets established this causal chain. This is my attempt to draw a literal chain or whatever. And the chain is people passing on the name to each other. And everyone that's linked in the chain is intending to use the name to refer to whoever the last person in the chain was using that name to refer to. And so then now, when I use the name Napoleon Bonaparte, I never met the guy or whatever because he died some time ago. My use of this name refers back to him because there's a chain linking me to him, a chain of people passing on the name. Okay, those are the two theories, but they both have problems. These are the problems. I'm going to go over them in a sec, but what's going to happen is that Gareth Evans publishes this paper in 1973. There are very few photographs of Evans available. The reason for that is that Evans died of cancer in 1980 at the age of 34. But even before that, he had made enormous contributions to the philosophy of mind and the philosophy of language. And this is one of them. This is one of the big ones, maybe the biggest. First, he sort of reiterated these problems, which Kripke had pointed out, problems for Searle's theory. But then he introduced these problems that no one had realized for Kripke's theory. So both of these theories are going to have problems. And what Evans does is he figures out what's right about Searle's theory and what's right about Kripke's theory, and he just sort of takes those parts, keeps them, gets rid of all the extra stuff, builds his own theory, and that's like, in my opinion, the correct theory of proper names. Like we've been talking about proper names this whole semester, and it just ends here with Evans. Evans just, in my opinion, gets it right. And then next, we're going to move on to definite descriptions. We're going to read Bertrand Russell, but we're not there yet. We've still got to just get through these problems and then introduce Evans's theory. Okay, so the Gödel-Schmidt problem, this was a problem for Searle's theory that Kripke introduced. I'm not going to go over that because we spent a whole lecture on it. You can find that video linked in the description. In the Evans paper that we read for today, Evans introduces his own example, this Goliath example, which is really just the same as the Gödel-Schmidt example. It's just a new version of it, or whatever. Here's how the example goes. What's the thing that most people know about Goliath? It was that he was killed by David. David, before he became king, this is like in the Bible or whatever, David had a little slingshot or whatever, like a slingy thing, and he threw a rock and hit Goliath in the head and killed him. Goliath was like a big, strong Philistine or something, one of the bad guys or whatever, and David killed him. That's the main piece of information in this cluster of information, this cluster of descriptions. for the name Goliath, the main piece of information is that David killed him. But suppose that David didn't really kill him. Suppose that David actually killed someone else and someone else killed Goliath or whatever. If that was the case, who would the name Goliath refer to if it turned out that David had actually killed someone else? Well, Searle's theory would tell us that the name Goliath just refers to whoever fits the descriptions. So the name Goliath would really be the name of some other person who David killed. But that's the wrong result, right? Searle's theory gets the wrong result. The right result is that the name Goliath still refers to Goliath, whoever Goliath was, even if it turns out that David didn't kill him. What's happening is that Searle is forced into this result because of what his theory is, right? The theory just says that the referent of the name, whatever the name refers to, the referent is just whatever fits the cluster of descriptions. And so if some other, soldier or whatever fits the description killed by David, then that other soldier has to be the referent of the name Goliath. Kripke's theory avoids this problem because the theory is that the referent is whatever is linked by the chain of causation. And the chain of causation of the name Goliath goes all the way back to like the little baby Goliath. So Kripke's theory just gets a totally different result. But Evans points out, and he's the first one to point this out, Kripke's theory has these other problems. The most famous example that Evans presents involves the island nation of Madagascar. This is the example that the paper has become most famous for, even though it really appears in just a few sentences. The explorer Marco Polo was on the African mainland, and he asked some locals what the name of a piece of land was. Like he pointed to some land over there, and he said, "What's it called?" And they told him that it was called Madagascar. But they were talking about this area of the African mainland, what is part of present-day Mozambique. But Marco Polo got confused and didn't understand. He thought that they were telling him that Madagascar was the name of this big island off the coast. So he started using the name Madagascar to talk about this island. And because he was very influential or whatever, everyone else started calling that island Madagascar. And now, without a doubt, Madagascar is the name not of some part of the African mainland, but of this big island. It's the second largest island nation in the world after Indonesia. But here's the thing. Kripke's theory gets the wrong result when it comes to the name Madagascar. The way that this whole causal chain works is that person A teaches person B some name, and person B intends to use that name to refer to the same thing that person A was using that name to refer to. Well, Marco Polo wanted to use the name Madagascar to refer to the same thing as the locals who were teaching him that name. So that link in the chain is preserved, and that link in the chain goes all the way back to the initial dubbing or baptism ceremony where someone said, okay, this bit of land, we're gonna call it Madagascar. Except for that bit of land that was named officially or dubbed Madagascar at some point in the past, we don't know how far back, that bit of land was on the African mainland. The causal chain of Kripke's theory leads back to a piece of the African mainland. So Kripke's theory has to say that Madagascar, the name, refers to this area in Mozambique, but it doesn't. The name Madagascar just definitely doesn't. It definitely refers to this giant island. And Evans gives another example that illustrates the same problem with Kripke's theory, the example of a baby swap. So you got two babies and they get their names, and they've been named. And then sometime after they're named, maybe when they're like 2 weeks old or something, they get swapped by accident or whatever. And then they go on to live their whole lives. Suppose that one of these babies practices over and over, gets really good at basketball, and becomes the point guard for the New York Knicks, and everyone calls him Jalen Brunson. Kripke's theory gets the result that in this scenario, the name Jalen Brunson doesn't refer to this guy who plays for the New York Knicks and who lived his whole life being called Jalen Brunson. Instead, according to Kripke's theory, we just follow the chain all the way back, and the chain actually leads to this other baby that was swapped with Jalen like 2 weeks after they were born. But that's just the wrong result. Like, that's bonkers. The name Jalen Brunson clearly refers to this guy who's the point guard for the New York Knicks and who everyone calls Jalen Brunson, and he answers to the name Jalen Brunson, and that's just his name, obviously. And you can start to sniff what's going wrong with Kripke's theory, right? Jalen Brunson has built up this whole portfolio, this whole cluster of descriptions, all this information about him, that he plays in the NBA, and that his dad is one of the coaches of the same team, and that he used to play for the Dallas Mavericks, and all this stuff. And Kripke's theory just ignores that. It just ignores this whole cluster of information. And by ignoring that and just focusing on the causal chain, Kripke's theory gets the wrong result. Okay, so both of these theories are wrong. What Evans realizes is that this whole bit about the cluster of descriptions, that's right. There is a cluster of descriptions, or a body of information, that's associated with a name, and that's important. That's somehow important. But also Evans realizes that the notion of causation, that's important too. The absurdity in supposing that the denotation of our contemporary use of the name Aristotle could be some unknown item whose doings are causally isolated from our body of information is strictly parallel to... Okay, stop right there for a second. Evans is drawing an analogy. On Searle's theory, there's no need for a causal connection. And Evans thinks this is absurd. The absurdity of thinking that all you need to do is fit some cluster of descriptions and you don't need to be causally related. The absurdity in that is analogous to something else. He's going to introduce some other kind of absurdity. Here we go. The absurdity in supposing that one might be seeing something one has no causal contact with, solely upon the ground that there is a splendid match between object and visual impression. Okay, so to explain this, I need to draw a diagram. So there's a person, right, and they have an eyeball, this is their eyeball, and they're looking at a shoe. This is my drawing of a shoe. And so the light bounces off the shoe and goes into the eyeball. That's some causation right there. And in the mind of this person, there's a visual image, like a little picture of the shoe in their head. Suppose also that there's an additional shoe. There's some other shoe, this is it. It's 1,000 miles away. This person has never interacted with it. They've never been in the same room as this other shoe or anything like that. But the image in their mind actually resembles this shoe a little bit more than it resembles this shoe. Like maybe there's a cloud in here blocking their sight of this shoe, and so they don't get a perfectly accurate picture in their head. And the picture that they do end up with actually matches this other shoe 1,000 miles away. Here's the question. Which shoe are they seeing? The answer, Evans thinks, is like, obviously they're seeing this shoe. The shoe that is causally related to them. The shoe that the light is bouncing off of, that's going into their eye, hitting their retina, and causing this mental image. That's the shoe that they're seeing. They're not seeing this shoe. This shoe is 1,000 miles away. They don't even know it exists. They have no interaction with it. Just because this shoe matches or fits, that doesn't mean that they're seeing this one. And that's kind of how absurd Searle's theory is, Evans thinks, right? Searle's theory just says that you've got a match. Whatever object fits or matches the cluster of descriptions. The cluster of descriptions is like an image, like a little drawing in your head, a little drawing with words. That's what descriptions are. And since it would be absurd to leave causation out of the story here of what this person is seeing, it would also be absurd to leave causation out of the story of what names refer to. Evans thinks that Kripke is right about the importance of causation, but he's wrong about this whole link in a chain thing. Like, forget about that. And he thinks that Searle is right that there's this body of information associated with the name. But the mistake is to think that the referent has to fit that body of information. No, forget about fitting the information. That's not it. What Evans is about to do is he's going to produce a new theory of proper names that's going to keep this cluster of descriptions, but it's going to involve a different way of relating to that cluster of descriptions. To illustrate what's going on here, think about the description has a thick head of hair. One way that someone could be related to this description is that they could fit it. They have this characteristic. They have a thick head of hair. I don't really anymore, but I'm sort of coming to accept it. However, there's this other way that someone could be related to this description. They could be the source, the causal source of that description. So for example, if I was wearing a wig, you might look at my head and you might think that it's real hair and you might say, oh, this guy, he's got a thick head of hair. In that case, I would not fit the description because I don't have a thick head of hair. But I would be the source of the description. Like you had that description pop into your mind and maybe then you associated that description with my name. You put it in the cluster of descriptions. You thought of that description. It originated from me. And someone can be the causal source of some description without actually fitting the description. So Evans tosses out this idea of fitting combines the causation with the cluster of descriptions, and produces his own theory that looks like this. The referent is the dominant causal source of the cluster of descriptions. So he keeps the cluster of descriptions part from Searle's theory, and he just says that the referent of a proper name is not what fits those descriptions, but what causes them, which he gets from Kripke's theory. The real weakness of the description theory lies not so much in the idea that the intended referent is determined in a more or less complicated way by the associated information. The problem with Searle's theory is not that there's some associated information, some cluster of descriptions that helps to determine the referent. That's not the problem with Searle's theory. The problem instead is, but the specific form the determination was supposed to take, fit. The problem was in thinking that it's by fitting those descriptions that the referent is selected or whatever. It's not by fitting, it's by causing. There is something absurd in supposing that the intended referent of some perfectly ordinary use of a name by a speaker could be some item utterly isolated, causally, from the user's community and culture, simply in virtue of the fact that it fits better than anything else the cluster of descriptions he associates with the name. That's the exact same point that we illustrated with that visual metaphor. The point is, it's absurd that the referent would be something that's causally isolated just because that this other thing far away that no one interacts with happens to fit some descriptions. I would agree with Kripke in thinking that the absurdity resides in the absence of any causal relation between the item concerned and the speaker. But it seems to me that he, that is Kripke, has mislocated the causal relation. The important causal relation lies between that item's states and doings and the speaker's body of information. Evans thinks that the relevant causal connection is between the object in the world and what it does and the information or the descriptions, not between the items being dubbed with a name and the speaker's contemporary use of it. The relevant causation is not that causal chain that Kripke identified between this dubbing ceremony, this naming ceremony, and then the contemporary use of the name. That's a mistake. Okay, but what about this word dominant? We know that the causation comes from Kripke's theory, the cluster of descriptions comes from Searle's theory, but what does it mean for something to be the dominant causal source of some descriptions or some information? Evans uses this bonkers like Napoleon diagram to illustrate this, and so I'm going to explain how to read this diagram and what's going on. As background information, you have to know that at the end of the 1700s, there was a revolution in France where they made this machine that could chop people's heads off, and they chopped off all the heads of all the rich people and then a bunch of the poor people too, a lot of head chopping. During this time, there was some random, not important soldier named Napoleon Bonaparte, and he managed to avoid getting his head chopped off, and then he rose to become the leader of this nation, France. And he thought to himself, you know, I'm good at war, so what if we just declare war on the entire world and try to conquer it? And he did, and he got pretty close, like he conquered most of Europe or whatever. And then that was the big thing. The big thing that he did in his life was he conquered most of Europe. And he decided he wanted to be emperor, but then when the Pope was right there and the Pope was gonna put the crown on him to make him an emperor, not just a king, you know, but like an emperor, Napoleon was like, no, you're not important enough, Mr. Pope. I'm gonna crown myself. And so he takes the crown from the Pope, puts it on his own head, makes himself the emperor. He's like conquered most of the world, good for him. But then like every other country in Europe gangs up on Napoleon, and finally they like defeat him and they conquer Paris in 1814. They take Napoleon and they don't want to kill him, right? Because if you kill him, he'll become this mythical figure, this like martyr or whatever. So instead, they imprison him on this island in the Mediterranean called Elba. But some like Mediterranean island can't contain him, so he escapes and he makes it back to France and he takes back over the army or whatever, and he's gonna take over the world again for a second time. But this is like a minor attempt because he gets defeated at the Battle of Waterloo, and this time they take him and they imprison him on an island all the way in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and he can't get away from that island, and so then he just like is stuck there and he dies at the age of 51, and that's it for Napoleon. The thing you need to know is that most of the important stuff that Napoleon did happened between 1793, when they beheaded Louis XVI, right, the old king of France, and 1814, when Napoleon was captured for the first time. You're supposed to read this diagram from the bottom up to the top because like time is going in that direction, and most of the important stuff that Napoleon did, he did it in this gap here. Evans wants us to imagine a scenario, which is diagram 1, where Napoleon, represented by alpha, and some other random guy, represented by beta, they live separate lives. But then in 1814, this imposter kidnaps Napoleon, kills him or whatever, gets rid of him, and then takes his place, like wears his hat and, pretends he's Napoleon. And really, let's suppose that this imposter is the one who escapes from Elba and fights at Waterloo. He takes over Napoleon's life for this little gap here at the end. Because the imposter only steps into the picture towards the end of Napoleon's life, the imposter is not the dominant causal source of all of this information, all of these descriptions of Napoleon. Rather, it's the original Napoleon, the alpha or whatever. That guy, he's the dominant causal source. And for that reason, Evans's theory gets the result that the name Napoleon refers to the original guy, the alpha, the one who conquered most of Europe. But in diagram 2, we see an alternative possibility. This is a case where the imposter captures and replaces Napoleon back in 1793, back when he was some unknown, soldier or whatever, before he did anything. He steals Napoleon's identity, starts introducing himself as Napoleon, then he rises to the top, rules the country of France, conquers most of Europe, gets defeated, goes to Elba, escapes, gets defeated again at Waterloo now, and then goes to St. Helena. He does all that stuff. In this case, it's now the imposter who's the dominant causal source of this cluster of descriptions, of all this information. He earned it, like he conquered Europe. He caused all of these descriptions. So in the case from diagram 2, Evans's theory gets the result that the name Napoleon, as I use it today, talking about French history or whatever, my use of that name refers not to the original Napoleon Alpha, but to this other guy, Beta, the imposter. But that seems exactly right? Because when we're talking about Napoleon, we're talking about this guy who conquered Europe and did all of this stuff. If it turns out that Napoleon was born with some different name, and as a young man stole the identity of someone else, and then did all of these things, well then, he's still Napoleon. A simple way to put it is that he stole this other guy's identity early enough. If you steal an identity early enough, then that becomes your identity. Oh, whoa. I just realized that this example from Gareth Evans in 1973 is the plot of the show Mad Men. Oh, okay, let me explain that. I haven't actually even seen Mad Men, but I know that there's this character, Don Draper. He's like the protagonist or whatever, and he's like really cool, and he doesn't get frazzled, and he's mean, and he says mean stuff or whatever. And there's this scene where he's been really mean to this guy. It's been like cruel. And the guy in the elevator says to him like, I feel bad for you. And Don Draper is just like, I don't think about you at all. And that's like, oh, that's like a good line, but that's mean, okay. Anyway, at some point in this show, it's revealed, sorry, I'm gonna ruin the show, I haven't even watched it. It's revealed that Don Draper fought in the Korean War, and while he was fighting in that war, he stole the identity of some other guy, like some other soldier died, and I guess he took his dog tags off his neck and stole this guy's identity. Like Don Draper was really originally named Richard something or whatever, and he stole the identity and became Don Draper. But then he went on to live this whole long life. And he worked at this ad agency in New York City and blah, blah, blah. Now, to illustrate Evans's point, I guess, with Don Draper as the example, suppose that someone walks up to Don Draper's secretary, who's sitting outside his office, and asks, is Don in there? And she says, Mr. Draper is in today, but he doesn't have time to meet with anyone. Is her sentence false? When she says that Mr. Draper is in there, is she wrong? Because really, Don Draper died in Korea or whatever? No, she's not wrong. She's using the name Don Draper to refer to this person that she's causally interacted with. The person who is now become the dominant source of all of this information, all this whole cluster of descriptions that she and everyone else in this company associates with the name Don Draper. This is actually an excellent illustration of Evans's point, right? In the hour or two after he steals the dog tags off the dead body and starts pretending to be Don Draper or whatever, he's not yet the dominant source of information because he's only been wearing these dog tags. He's only assumed this identity for a couple of hours. But once it's been years and years and years and years, and he's built up all of this information, these descriptions that all of these people associate with the name, well then he's the dominant source. Now that's just his name. Okay, that's it. We're done with proper names. Next, we move on to definite descriptions.
Hi, it's me, in my office. If you have a long enough attention span to make it this far in the video, then you might be interested in the book that I'm writing. If you click the link in the description below and put in your email address, I will email you when the book is ready. I promise I will not send you a million emails. I will not sell your email address to spammers. All you will get is an email from me when the book is for sale. And I will pick a bunch of those emails, and those people will get free copies of the book.